Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into a force of nature that's both mesmerizing and, well, pretty terrifying. Floods.
Yeah, they really are something else.
You all sent in some amazing stuff about floods, and it got us thinking, they're more than just like overflowing rivers, right?
Right.
They've shaped civilizations. I mean, come on, the oldest story we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh, starts with a flood, a massive one.
It's incredible, isn't it? Like, the flood in that story is on a scale we can barely even fathom today. It wipes out almost all of humanity.
It really makes you wonder, like, okay, we've known about floods forever, right? So why do they still seem to catch us so off guard?
Well, I think part of it is it's not just the water itself, right? It's us. It's how we react to it, the decisions we make. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit of not learning from our past mistakes.
Oh, tell me about it. The source material you sent, it has this then versus now comparison. And it's kind of scary how even after centuries of dealing with floods, we're still making some of the same mistakes.
Yeah, it's like we're staring history right in the face and choosing to ignore the lessons.
Exactly. And the source even points out specific cities like New Orleans and Jakarta. These are major cities built right in floodplains.
It's a pattern we see over and over again throughout history.
But like, why? Why do we keep doing this?
Well, think about it. That land is valuable, right? Usually flat, easy to build on. And there's this almost inherent belief that we can like outsmart nature with engineering, build a levee and we're good.
So we put all our faith in these like engineered solutions, but they're not always enough, are they?
Exactly. Levees can fail. And sometimes they just shift the problem downstream.
Oh, I see. So it's like a kind of a false sense of security sometimes.
That's right. And there's a growing movement towards incorporating what they call natural infrastructure.
Yeah.
Things like restoring wetlands.
Oh, okay.
And floodplains, things that act as natural buffers, like giant sponges.
So it's more about working with nature, not just trying to dominate it.
That's the idea. And of course, we can't talk about floods without talking about climate change. The source material put it pretty bluntly. It said climate change has dialed the planet's flood settings to, quote, ultraviolence.
Whoa, ultraviolence.
Yeah.
So how is climate change making things worse? Exactly.
Well, you've got melting glaciers, sea levels rising, which leads to bigger storm surges, and then the weather patterns are shifting, right? So more rain, more intense rain.
So basically those once-in-a-century floods.
They're happening way more often, like every few years.
Like what happened in Pakistan in 2022?
Exactly.
33 million people displaced. I mean, how do you even grasp a number that big?
It's mind-boggling. Think of it this way. That's like flooding the entire population of Australia twice.
Twice. Wow. And it's not just the immediate impact, right? There's the economic fallout, public health crises, people losing their homes.
It's devastating. And it takes years, sometimes decades to recover.
And that brings us to some pretty sobering examples from history. The source mentions the Yellow River flood of 1931. Up to 4 million people died.
The Yellow River's got this nickname, China's Sorrow. And for good reason. The 31 flood, it was a perfect storm of factors, natural and human-made. You had heavy rains, deforestation making the land more vulnerable, poor infrastructure. It all added up to this unimaginable tragedy.
And the source talks about what happened after the flood, too. Famine, disease, like the suffering didn't end when the water receded?
Right. It often just begins there. Agriculture is disrupted, water supplies are contaminated, and that creates the perfect conditions for disease to spread.
And then there's the Great Flood of 1862 here in California. It was so bad, it basically turned Sacramento into like a Venice knockoff for 6 months.
It was a wild time. I mean, entire towns underwater, businesses ruined, the state's economy just crippled.
Makes you wonder if something like that could happen again. I mean, especially with climate change, right? Could we see an even bigger flood?
It's definitely a possibility. And it leads to this idea of the arc storm. It's a hypothetical mega flood that scientists say could dwarf even the 1862 flood.
The arc storm. Okay, that sounds a little terrifying.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder that California is incredibly vulnerable to flooding, and climate change is making it worse.
So we've looked at the past, we've got the present, and it's clear floods are a force to be reckoned with. But here's a chilling fact. Did you know that more people die from floods than any other natural disaster?
It's true, and it might seem surprising. But floods are a silent killer. Drownings, obviously, but also disease from contaminated water, collapsing infrastructure, even the hardships of displacement.
It's almost poetic in a dark way how the word deluge comes from the Latin diluere, which means to wash away.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's a pretty powerful word.
It is.
And it brings us back to that idea from the source material about floods being Earth's way of hitting refresh on our bad choices.
Yeah. We build in danger zones, rely on levees that might not hold, and often we just ignore the warning signs until it's too late.
It's like we're arguing with the water bill when Earth is the landlord about to serve us an eviction notice.
And the crazy part is, we keep trying to fight it.
Exactly. So the question is, how long can we keep doing this? How long can we keep building and rebuilding in flood-prone areas before we realize maybe it's time to change our approach?
That's a question we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
So we just talked about how floods can kind of feel like, Earth's way of saying, hey, maybe you need to rethink some things. But does that mean we're doomed to repeat this cycle forever, building and rebuilding in these flood-prone areas? Or, is there a way to break free from that?
That's the big question, isn't it? And I don't think it's about, giving in to nature. It's about learning to live with it. Really live with it, in a way that works for both of us.
So how do we do that? How do we go from, trying to control the water to actually respecting it, adapting to it?
Well, for starters, I think we can learn a lot from the past. Throughout history, people have figured out ways to live in flood-prone areas. And not just survive, but thrive.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. Think about traditional rice farming in Southeast Asia. They've got these incredible systems where the paddies are actually designed to be flooded. It's part of the process.
Wow. So they're not just dealing with the floods, they're using them to their advantage.
Exactly. But of course, bringing those kind of ideas into a modern city, that's a whole other challenge.
Right. Cities are a lot more complex than rice paddies. So are there any, modern solutions that show promise?
Oh, definitely. One that's gaining a lot of traction is the idea of sponge cities.
Sponge cities. Okay, I'm intrigued. What does that even mean?
Well, basically, it's about designing a city to soak up rainwater. You guessed it, a giant sponge.
Ah.
So instead of all that water rushing through concrete channels, it's slowly absorbed.
So parks, green spaces, stuff like that.
That's part of it, yeah. Parks, permeable pavements, green roofs, all these things that help the city absorb the water and replenish the groundwater.
So it's kind of like bringing a little bit of nature back into the urban environment.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about flood prevention. It helps with air quality, reduces the urban heat island effect. It just makes cities more livable.
It sounds amazing, but I imagine retrofitting an entire city to be like that. It's got to be a huge undertaking.
It is. It definitely takes a shift in how we think about urban planning.
Yeah.
And a lot of investment. But the long-term benefits are huge.
Okay, so sponge cities, that's one thing. What else is out there?
Well, another big area of progress is in early warning systems. With better sensors and data analysis, we can predict floods more accurately, and that gives people time to prepare.
That's going to be crucial, especially as climate change makes things more unpredictable. So it sounds like technology has a big role to play in all this.
For sure, it gives us some powerful tools. But at the end of the day, it comes down to human decisions, our actions.
So even with all the tech in the world, we still need to be smart about how we live with water. So what can we do as individuals? What are some concrete things people can do to make a difference?
Well, first off, just be aware. Know your local flood risks. Understand the history of flooding in your area. That way you can make better decisions, prepare for emergencies.
Okay, so knowledge is power. But what about beyond our own homes? Can we do more to help the situation on a larger scale?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Get involved.
Yeah.
Support policies that promote smart development, flood-resilient infrastructure, the things that actually address the root causes. Because these issues, they affect all of us.
So it's kind of a multi-pronged approach. Personal preparedness, community action, and pushing for systemic change.
Exactly. And it all comes back to this idea, not just protecting ourselves from floods, but really understanding our place in nature. Figuring out how to live with water in a way that's sustainable for everyone, humans, and the environment.
That's a great way to put it. As we move into the final part of our deep dive, let's keep that idea in mind. We've looked at the history, we've seen the challenges, we've even glimpsed some of the solutions, but there's still a lot to unpack, a lot to think about. So stay with us as we explore what a truly resilient future might look like. A future where we coexist with water, not just fight against it.
Wow, we've really gone deep on this one, huh? From ancient stories to modern cities, floods have always been with us. But looking ahead, there was this one question from the source material that really stuck with me. It asked, if Earth is the landlord and floods are the eviction notice, how long until we stop arguing with the water bill?
It's a pretty powerful analogy. It really makes you think about, like, our role on this planet. Are we just tenants who don't want to pay the rent?
I think for a long time we've acted like we can just, you know, control nature, bend it to our will. But as we've seen, that has its limits, especially with climate change throwing a wrench in the works. Yeah, that old way of thinking, the control and dominate approach, it's just not going to cut it anymore. We need to adapt, be more resilient, and maybe, just maybe, learn to respect nature a little bit more.
So how do we actually do that? How do we go from control to, like, coexistence?
Well, we're starting to see some promising shifts, like those sponge cities we talked about. That's a good example of working with nature, not against it.
Yeah, and it's not just about the tech, right? It's about changing our mindset, realizing that we're part of this whole ecosystem, not separate from it.
Exactly. Our actions have consequences. We need to own up to that.
Hmm.
And remember, we're not just building cities for ourselves. We share this planet with a lot of other living things.
It's like that quote from the source material, floods are not just about water, they're about us. It's a good reminder that we have a role to play in all this.
And those choices we make, they have a ripple effect. It's not just about the immediate impact of a flood, it's about ecosystems, economies, communities for generations to come.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope people take away from all this?
Floods are a force of nature. They've shaped our planet, our history. But they also show us our choices, our vulnerabilities, and how resilient we can be. The key is to learn from what's happened, adapt to what's happening now, and create a future where we can live with water, not just fight it.
Well said. And to everyone listening, maybe next time you see a river, a stream, even just the rain falling, you'll look at it a little differently, with a little more respect. Because floods might be a force of nature, but how we respond to them, that's what makes us human. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and we'll see you next time.